Welcome to the Diesel Podcast presented by DFC Diesel. If you're watching this on YouTube and aren't subscribed, make sure and click the subscribe button, like, comment, let us know what you think about the episode. If there's a particular guest or topic that you'd like to hear from, we love to take your suggestions and then get them on to future episodes. Today I'm going to be chatting with SEMA and talking about the banning of the internal combustion engines, not just in California, but it would affect 40% of Americans. So the title we have, it's not clickbait, it's real. So I wanted to talk with them about ways we can get involved and talk with lawmakers and to be able to influence this decision. So I'm definitely looking forward to it today. Before we get to it, wanted to give a shout out to one of our sponsors. It helps make the Diesel Podcast possible. Kershaw Knives has a 40% off MSRP discount code for you. If you go to kershaw.kaiusa.com, use code 25TDP40, get your 40% off MSRP. It's a great way to save some money and get some cool gear. You're in the market for a new EDC knife or something for hunting, fishing, around the job site, around the house. They've got you covered with a bunch of different options for blade steel, blade shape, different opening mechanisms, different handle designs, and their whole lineup's designed to meet any budget. So we really appreciate them offering that discount code just for Diesel Podcast listeners. All right, let's get to today's podcast with SEMA and talking about the banning of the internal combustion engine. Karen, welcome to the Diesel Podcast. I'm extremely excited to chat with you. I love being able to talk with SEMA. We've had different people at SEMA on over the years, and it's so amazing the different facets of automotive and the automotive industry that SEMA is involved in. And you're in a really interesting part of it. I look forward to chatting with you today. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'd love to start with a bit more about yourself, what you do at SEMA, what your focus is, and then from there, there's so many different topics we can go into.
Sure. So technically, my title is Senior Vice President of Public and Government Affairs. What that means, taking that long title into, is I oversee all of our advocacy, legislative, and regulatory work, and head up the DC office, or the DC office that's the team that's primarily based in DC. Dealing not only with Washington, D.C., but also state capitals and local governments all over the country. So I joined SEMA about 2.5 years ago now. It's time flies when you're having fun. And, really when I came on board, the directive that I received was we want more in the advocacy space. And really that's where I've been focused, not only adding additional assets and people and experts to the team, but also just really taking the time to harness the passion and enthusiasm that we have in our industry and using that as our political muscle. Because it's one thing to go lobby lawmakers and tell them what we want, but the fact is that we also have to engage those of the broader community that encompasses SEMA and the automotive aftermarket world, and help them have their voices heard and help support the work that we're trying to do on behalf of everyone.
That part really interests me for a few different reasons. One is, before I ever got into diesel trucks or automotive stuff, politics was what I was into. That was my major. I still follow it today. It still interests me. And then as I've combined that with being an enthusiast, and I've been in this industry for 13, 14 years now, I've been able to see different sides of it. And I had mentioned before the podcast, one of the most popular topics that we ever cover have to do with emissions, or they have to do with
Mhm.
emission changes. And then in the racing side, that pops up as well. And one of the common things that I hear the most from shop owners, from listeners, enthusiasts themselves, is they say, well, what can I do to help? And so I'd love to spend a little bit of time talking about the policy making, the lobbying, the involvement, maybe not even just in DC, but then also with state governments and the political process. What can we do, or what does SEMA do, and then what can we do as individuals to be able to protect these hobbies, these businesses, as it relates to the automotive aftermarket?
Yeah, I think there's a few different things that where people can get involved. I think the easiest way is through our SEMA Action Network, which is semasan.com for anybody that is not already on the list or signed up for legislative alerts. That's the easiest way. It's free. But that's where we keep everybody up to date when there's something that's impacting them. It may be something in their state. It may be their member of Congress or the U.S. Senator that we need to influence up in Washington. And so that's the easiest way to do it. I think that the there's a few other ways to be part of the effort. We also do, we have obviously a large rally that we do every other year in Washington, D.C., which is we bring people into Washington, D.C. to come connect with their lawmakers directly on the advocacy agenda that we're focused on at that time. So anybody that wants to come talk to their lawmakers directly, that's also a great way to do it. But we actually do a California rally as well up in Sacramento every year, because obviously California tends to be a bit of a challenging state for the industry. And so it's one that we really spend a lot of time and resources in trying to sort of help shape policy there. But for anybody that's California based, we're actually going to be hosting a rally there in Sacramento in June. So, and I'll be able to give my information at the end of this so that we can keep people posted about that. But I think the other way too is, is also for, especially people that are, interested in engaging with their lawmakers is to invite them to the facility, especially if you've got like a manufacturing facility or a builder shop or whatever the case may be, but invite your lawmakers to come visit and have that one-on-one conversation and be able to have the discussion about how policy is impacting you and your business and those that you employ, the kind of business that you do, and developing those one-on-one relationships, I think is really important. That's something that we really emphasize, especially not only on our manufacturing side, but also on our racing side, like our racetracks, is having lawmakers interact and get to know you so that they have that a more personal relationship and can sort of touch and feel something that they may not understand when they're looking at, just words on paper that we all call legislation.
Do you find that lawmakers are open to discussing issues as it pertains to the automotive aftermarket, the things that are really important to SEMA? And then does it sometimes catch them off guard? Do they maybe not understand how big or how influential these companies in this industry can be?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things when I started is, I heard a lot of, oh, we didn't even think about the aftermarket, or, oh, you guys are a thing. Everyone sees the aftermarket on the road,
Yeah.
whether it's just an external accessory or, their buddy or they may have some performance related parts on their vehicles, but they don't sort of there wasn't sort of this understanding that it's an industry unto itself, which is why we did the economic impact report shortly after I started, which really sat there and put a value to the U.S. economy of what our industry, so the aftermarket industry, contributes to the U.S. economy, not only in economic impact but also the number of jobs. And so that's been something that we've really been working heavily towards over the past 2 years is helping demonstrate to folks that there's this whole segment of the automotive aftermarket or this of the automotive industry called the automotive aftermarket that people don't always sort of realize is impacted. And so I do think that lawmakers are receptive to that, because when you start to put numbers like, and this is obviously a national number, we're a $337 billion economic impact to the US economy. That's billion with a B. And to put that in perspective, and we also employ 1.3 million people. And that's, we're largely small businesses. So that's a pretty sizable number. And when you kind of compare it to other industries that we all think of as big in this country, we're actually bigger than the soda industry. We're bigger than the aviation industry. We're bigger than the wine industry. And I always joke that if we all stop drinking beer, we might overtake beer. But I don't think that'll happen. So, but just to put it in perspective, we're not small potatoes. We're not, we may have niche products, but we're not a small niche part of the economy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the part that really, really strikes me with the guests and the people that I talk to. They're mostly small businesses. A lot of
Mhm.
them, they started themselves and they've grown it to 50 or 100 employees or sometimes more. And then it has a very personal story to it. And I know that they're willing to adapt with the times, they're willing to adapt with new technologies, but they also want to feel like they have someone speaking for them in front of lawmakers so that they can have that voice that you talked about and be able to say,
Yeah.
hey, can we accommodate this? We can't change quite this fast. What can we do in a number of different areas? And so I think that's really important, to be able to focus on. What would you say would be some things that you're proud of having done with SEMA as far as working with legislators and lawmakers, some accomplishments, things we could point to and say, this was great that this happened. This is just the start of what we're doing, but I'm really curious what you would define as successes so far.
Sure. Well, and I think, one of the things with regards to the SEMA advocacy team is because we do represent so many, largely small businesses don't have big government affairs teams like big corporations do. So we are, this is one of the value adds of a SEMA membership and being part of the SEMA community is that we are that lobbying team for you. Um, and so that's something we take a lot of pride in. But in terms of successes, I mean, obviously in our industry, we represent so many sectors, right? We're not just sort of one issue kind of people. We deal with emissions, we deal with driver safety systems, we deal with off-roading and access to public lands, we deal with liability and liability of products that the aftermarket deals with. We deal with tax policy. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we tackle on behalf of the industry. But in terms of some of the wins, I mean, I think we've really had a great couple of years, and not all of this will necessarily touch on the diesel interested community. Although, I'm an off-roader when I do have some free time, and I own a diesel Jeep Wrangler 2021, which I absolutely adore. I actually would cry more if that anything ever happened to that vehicle than any other vehicle. um, but the fact is so some of the different successes is that in the off-road community we actually had the Explorer Act passed last year and signed by President Biden before he left office, and this is something that's really important to, again, the off-road folks in terms of streamlining permitting for groups that are doing events in public lands, making it more accessible, making public lands more accessible for the motorized recreation community. Also dealing with some of the governmental challenges that come along with sort of our, what the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service have to deal with. So that was one win that we're really happy with. We also did, and this is actually a perfect example of when a small business calls us, one of our member companies calls us, is that there was an issue in Georgia. And there was an old law that nobody knew about that had been passed, I think, in like late 70s, early 80s, that was regarding lifted trucks. And essentially, lifted trucks were kind of not allowed in Georgia. They had this very fluffy kind of language that didn't really put any parameters, that really didn't provide any standards for what's considered a lifted vehicle. And so he called and said, hey, this is kind of a problem because it's actually a liability issue. There was actually a major lawsuit after an accident involving a lifted vehicle. Is there anything you can do to help? And so we dug into it and said, okay, well, we found this old law that nobody knew about, and said, okay, well, what we can do is we can put some structure around this, so that there can be better definitions for those that are lifting their vehicles, not only as a consumer, but also those that are selling those products, and create some structure around that so that there's standards that people can meet, that the law will actually help develop or help state. So Christian Robinson, who heads up our state government affairs, led that effort with some of our SEMA members. We actually built a coalition because it wasn't just one company that was impacted there. And we were able to get that legislation passed last year. Found the legislative sponsor, figured it all out, went through all the hearings processes and so forth. So that's another example. That's, I think, one example of where a small business owner just calls up and saying, "Hey, can you help me fix this?" And then, of course, I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but everything around the internal combustion engine bans, EV mandates, whichever way you want to position it. To me, it's the same side of the same coin, or two sides of the same coin. But we've also had a lot of success on that issue, not only with what we're sort of dealing with right now at the federal level, where we can finally put some of this stuff to bed with regards to California's power over the rest of the country as it relates to our vehicle technology. But we've also gotten legislation passed in 9 different states pushing back against EV mandates, saying, with states saying we're going to be vehicle technology neutral, which is where we wanted them to be. And so, and there was a strategy behind that. There was a reason for that, because there were at the time 17 states that followed California's emissions laws. And that's work that's been happening for over 20 years, that's been pushed and sort of gaining momentum. And sort of the strategy on the other side is to be able to say to the federal government, like, look, 17 states are already attached to this, so you might as well just go do this at the federal level. And so really our purpose for doing this was to now show that that actually isn't a national mandate, and that there are other states that actually believe differently and have put it into statute saying that their government should stay technology neutral. And as part of that effort, we actually had Virginia's governor actually ended up decoupling the state from California standards, which is great. And then 2 other states, Connecticut and Maine, have also pulled back on their following of California. So I'd say those are sort of 3 different wins and 3 different segments of the industry that we've had over the past couple of years.
That part of it has come up on some other podcasts that I've done with people who either do vehicle tuning or they make hard parts, and they've talked about the process and basically how, in order to be able to sell their product, they have to go through California to sell it maybe in another state. And I think it's great to focus in on the EV mandate, the internal combustion engine. I think it's the advanced cars too.
Yep.
That we're going to chat about, and I think we can relate it to why, if you don't live in California, it's very important. But what is this mandate or this goal or law that California has by 2035 with internal combustion engines?
Sure. So as you call it, it's Advanced Clean Cars 2, which we just refer to it shorthand ACC 2. But this was a full 100% internal combustion engine ban starting in 2035, meaning any new vehicles sold have to be zero emissions. And so California, just to give a little bit of historical context, and your folks may already know a lot of this, but California was granted some exceptions in the original Clean Air Act that was passed. This is the Federal Clean Air Act, decades ago, because of their unique pollution issues that they dealt with, because of their geography and the harbors and everything like that. And so they've had that exception. But it was intended to be a California only exception. And that it was to be, to deal with issues that were unique to California. It did allow for other states to, quote unquote, if you will, follow some of the standards. But, over the decades, the reach has been not just because it's unique to California. It's now something that's impacting a significant amount of the population. And when you look at ACC2, especially because you now have what we call 16 CARB states, so 16 states that follow California in some form or another. There's actually 11 states that have adopted ACC2 out of that 16. We're no longer dealing just uniquely with California's specific needs. And when you calculate that out, especially if you use the 16 states, that's roughly 40% of the US marketplace. That's 40% of American consumers that are going to be impacted by this. There was also this memo of understandings that a lot of the OEs had signed with California after actually both ACC1 and ACC2 were put into law, saying, well, regardless, you're still going to follow what we say. And we saw, I don't know if you guys saw this or not, but last year, Stellantis, because they weren't part of California's rules or hadn't, given them an agreement that we're going to follow this, California was going to structure their formula for emissions differently and it was more punitive. So there was an announcement by Stellantis that they were no longer going to ship ICE vehicles where they have a hybrid or EV version available to any of the CARB states.
Wow.
And so, they've now, Stellantis now, I think since come to an agreement with California. But the fact is that California is still impacting a significant number of the American population. But as we've used in some of our press releases, we're not the United States of California. We're the United States of America. So California is really, to us, has really overreached. ACC2 in particular, because of a ban on the internal combustion engine. And the thing is, we're not anti-EV. We want government to stay neutral when it comes to vehicle technology, regardless of what it is that you want to drive, because what's good for somebody in Louisiana or Texas is different than somebody in Minnesota, Wisconsin, New York, Vermont, and all the rest of the country. And so, and not to mention the innovation that the automotive industry has shown it's capable of doing is that, by banning the internal combustion engine, you're banning the technology, and the technology is not what creates emissions, it's what we put through it. And the fact is that there's been a ton of innovation in the fuel space to, again, lower the carbon footprint, if you will, or the carbon impact of what's being put through the engine, that to us, it's a little silly to get rid of the engine when there's so much that can happen in what it is that what we actually put through the engine.
Common question we get from you guys a lot is, hey, I need a diesel engine. I either, I can't wait this long to get one, or normal place I get stuff from it just takes too long, or they don't have the parts in it that I need. Maybe my truck's not stock, or I tow heavy with it. I don't want to go back with just a stock engine. DFC Diesel is a sponsor of the podcast. We worked with them, hand in hand on doing episodes, answering technical questions. They have a complete lineup of Cummins, Duramax, and Power Stroke remanufactured engines that are set to a standard of ISO 9001 2015 standards, which is a huge deal in the aftermarket. And there's certain levels of quality testing, validation that are required for that. So when you get one of those engines, the type of quality that's built behind it, with an industry-leading warranty that's really comprehensive. And the other thing with that is, sometimes the options that are out there, it's a basic OEM engine. You want a little bit more. You don't want to have the same failure again. So there's a bunch of different series of engines that they have, from core, street, tow haul, and also the Speed of Air series, which we've covered on the podcast before. There's a lot of really cool benefits to it. And if you have questions about that, reach out to them. If you don't know the type of engine that you're looking for, if you go to dfcdiesel.com, there's a ton of info there. You can send an email or you can reach out to them. Also, they're working with Speed of Air pistons, which it's the only piston that pays for itself. And there's a lot of really cool technology behind it. So you can add that into your build and be able to get better fuel economy, increase power, increase torque, and better engine life out of it. Some of the most common engine applications or series of engines that they have with that lead time, a lot of them are in stock or they have really short lead times. So you can check your favorite retailer or go to dfcdiesel.com, check them out, see what's in stock, see what you can get. If you have questions, maybe you want to do something that's outside of the normal series of engines, they have tons of choices for rods, cranks, pistons, valve train upgrades, tons of different things. So if you're in the market, definitely make sure and head on over and check them out. That's been the really tough part, because I find, as an enthusiast, and when I think of EVs, the thing that jumps out to me the most is the instantaneous power, the performance side. And when I have conversations with people about it, I don't find that they're anti-EV. They're just anti being forced to pick it. Right. And through different conversations, the big challenge that we think about is, an EV might work perfect in downtown Los Angeles, driving around town, but how are you going to, at say 2035 or some point in the future, how are you going to use an EV pickup truck on a farm and tow and haul and all these different things that impact them? And I think maybe the knowledge is more now, where we understand, for whatever reason, another state might say, well, California's done the work already. They've already laid the groundwork. Let's just follow what they're doing so we don't have to spend the money. Or it could be politically aligned, or any number of different factors. But 40% of America is a huge number of people. And I think that speaks to the importance of this. So as it relates to ACC2, what are you working on? What is SEMA focusing on with this particular issue?
Sure. So, one of the things that we did is, this is obviously an issue that we've been working on now for 2 years, a little over 2 years. And, we did all of the EPA public comment. Some of our members also testified. We went through all of that process, and the EPA still did what it wanted to do in terms of accepting ACC2 or granting that waiver. But one of the things that we saw was that the American consumers, I mean, outside of those of us that are involved in politics every day, they've got real lives. They actually they actually have a life. They've got, soccer games and family picnics and jobs to go to. And so one of the things that we saw is that American consumers, and to us, American voters, didn't understand the connection between these EV mandates and why it should even matter to them. Because to them, they're like, oh, well, I may buy an EV or I may not, but I'll, when I'm ready to buy my next vehicle, I'll just make that decision at that time. And they weren't understanding that this was a decision that was being made for them. And especially, when you look at the statistics right now that people are holding on to their vehicles longer
Yeah.
than they have before, for a variety of reasons. One, obviously, our vehicle technologies and our, the engineering that comes out of the OEs is a lot better. I would say that. But also there's things like cost. And when you look at the rising costs, and especially what we've seen since COVID, the cost of a new vehicle has gone up by a tremendous amount. And then when you add, say, a $10,000 premium onto that, if you have to go to an EV, that's huge. So anyway, so we were testing it with American voters. We did some opinion research and so forth. And so when we started connecting the dots for folks, people were like, "Hold on, that's not American. America's about choice." And so we're like, "Yes, we agree." So we actually started what was called a super PAC, and it's called Driving Force Action, and that allowed us to exercise political muscle. The reason why we had to create this sort of separate entity is actually because of federal election laws. So more laws that we all have to follow and deal with. But it allowed us to now bring the issue to the voters and be very specific about where candidates stood on these issues. And so we did that first in the Virginia elections in 2023. They have an odd year election cycle. And so we actually focused in on educating in three target state Senate race, or excuse me, four Senate races that were toss up races. And three of the four candidates actually that we backed won, because we were trying to sort of utilize or see, like, educate voters and explain to them some of these other issues other than some of the more, obviously hot political topics that are a part of the political discourse today that is not our area to focus in on. So anyway, so we saw the success of that, as well as the ability for us to bring awareness to this issue. We were able to test how aware, or actually very unaware, Virginia voters were about the fact that they were tied to California, and showed that once we were able to talk to them in all the different ways we can talk to them, that the awareness on this issue grew by a significant amount. So then, as the presidential campaign unfolded, we this remained a central issue, and with two candidates that have very specific voting records on this, like action records. It wasn't just two people we don't know, and they'll give us all promises and
Yeah.
and we'll all have to trust it. And so it was a really unique place in sort of political history, if you will, at least from an automotive aftermarket perspective, is the fact that such an automotive issue is like central in this past presidential campaign. And so we ended up revving up the super PAC again and focused our time into the battleground states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, a little bit in Georgia. So those are probably all familiar for all of us still dealing with the election hangover of hearing constantly about those states. But obviously key states, and especially where voters are particularly probably a little more sensitive to this issue of mandating the types of vehicle technology and how they use their vehicles, what they want. And so we educated them on, here's the difference between the two. Here's the difference between the two candidates, because we had very specific voting records for both of them. And so we also believe that to be have been very impactful in the outcome, in which, President Trump ended up doing what he promised on day one, signed the executive order to get rid of the EV mandates.
With the with California doing this, and we were talking a bit before the podcast about like a fly-in that you guys have in early March, and I love to be able to connect the kind of policy and lawmaking with action or things that people can do to take part in it, to feel like they're contributing. What do you guys have planned in early March as far as with ACC2?
So what we're waiting for right now, and this is all again procedural mumbo jumbo, the stuff that does frustrate everybody about Washington, because there's all this procedural stuff. Unfortunately, when the president signed his executive order, it doesn't just go poof, go away. There's a lot of procedural unraveling, and which is going to happen with the federal mandates that the Biden administration had done. But the one tool that was in kind of everyone's toolbox with regards to ACC2 is the fact that it was a waiver that was signed by the EPA, just days before the Biden administration left office. And what it does, and because of that, the EPA and the Trump administration were able to utilize what's called the Congressional Review Act, which is the CRA. So you'll see people mentioning CRA. That's what that is. And what it does is that within a specific time frame, the EPA can transmit, as they should have done in the first place, but previous administration didn't, send it back to Congress, and Congress can disapprove of that waiver, and essentially say that's not what the law intended. We don't approve of this. So that's actually the window that we're in right now. We're in a 60-day clock for Congress to take action and finally put some finality, not only around the EV mandates and internal combustion engine ban that California has done, but also help better define what California's reach is and isn't. And so I think that's one of the things that's really, really important out of this. So we have this mini fly-in that's happening March 4th and 5th. We kind of did a call to action actually early last week, my team, because this all happened Friday night of President's Day weekend. The EPA said, we're transmitting. So our team did not have a long weekend, unfortunately. But decided to put together this mini rally because so many people have been involved with this issue over the past couple of years. And so it's like, hey, let's have some folks show up in Washington, not only to advocate to support the CRA for maybe some lawmakers who might be on the fence or maybe not necessarily on our side, but also to provide reinforcement, encouragement to the lawmakers who have been such huge champions of ours on this issue, just so that they know they've got people that have their backs, because that's really one of the big things when it comes to politics, is making sure that when you're asking a politician to do something, is that you want to provide them that air cover, that they're not just going to be out on a ledge by themselves, sort of speaking to the wind, is that they've got an army behind them. And so we just really wanted to take the opportunity to reinforce with lawmakers, you're doing the right thing, go, go, go. Or if you're on the fence, here's why you should think about being, supportive of this, and let's get this thing over the finish line. And essentially we have now less than 60 days to do it.
That was one of the reasons I was so excited to do this podcast, because I try to pay attention to everything I can, but I can't get all the information or process it all. But when I was, reading about it and then what you guys were doing, I thought, there's this platform, we have this audience we've had for 9 years, and they listen about diesel trucks. They've heard these tuners and different companies talk about what they face as businesses working with California. We need to talk about this right now so that people hear it and listen. And I think that this is more of a general question I wanted to ask you, but I think it fits in with what we've discussed today. Is sometimes people can say, I don't want to get involved in politics. I don't like it. I tune it out. But I think over the last 5-6 years, especially in diesel and in the business sense, they've realized you have to engage. You have to be involved. You have to speak up. You have to network. You have to be involved. Otherwise, you have no say over what's going to dictate your business, what you can sell, how successful you can be. Mm-hmm. And I think there's also a segment of people who think, I really enjoy this. I love that I could be involved. What you've talked about doing with SEMA. What would your message be to the business owners that are out there that are kind of on the fence? They don't know if they want to be involved. They don't know if they want to call you up or SEMA up and get involved and do other things. What would you tell them? Why is it important for them to be involved?
Well, again, it goes back to who the voice is, right? And the fact is that who are these businesses largely? You're largely small businesses. You're in manufacturing, in automotive. These are all really important segments of the American of who America is, and it's and so to I know I talk to folks all the time, business owners and so forth, saying, "Well, I'm just a small guy." I'm just a small guy, so no one's going to listen to me. But I think that's actually the power of working with SEMA and the work that we're doing is because, yeah, we're a bunch of small guys, but together, hugely impactful. Because again, we're not big corporations with large lobbying teams that can sit there and navigate. And quite frankly, a lot of us want the same thing. Now, we may want sort of different nuances of different pieces of this, but when you look at what we're dealing with right now with the internal combustion engine ban, if there's a ban on internal combustion engines, there is no diesel tuning industry in the
Yep.
future, right? And so let's get to sort of the brass tacks here. Let's talk about the bottom line, because at the end of the day, when we looked at it with from a SEMA perspective, like 33% of our industry is internal combustion engine dependent, regardless if that's gasoline or diesel. But the fact is that that's over $100 billion of economic impact. That's over 300,000 jobs nationwide that can be at risk. And we all know that, for those of us in manufacturing and especially in this industry, you can't just flip a switch and be like, oh, okay, well, I'm an exhaust system creator. I'm just going to switch to EV. Well, there is no exhaust in EV, and so again, helping lawmakers make that connection is really important. And that's how small businesses can really engage. We're going to be actually sending out, for those that are SEMA members, we'll be sending out a note, I think actually probably later this week through our e-news, asking individual businesses to sign on to a letter to Capitol Hill. So those that can't come to Washington to walk the halls, because you guys have businesses to run, but just again continuing to communicate with lawmakers and showing and bringing our segment of the industry and our segment of the economy, bringing their voice forward to be able to say, hey, when you say you support the small guy, here's the small, and I'm going to say in air quotes because we're not small, but the small guys and gals, and help bring that voice forward. So, and look, I get questions all the time too about people are concerned, like, oh, I'm not really political and, all that kind of stuff. And, look, the other part of this too is that we don't seek to be partisan, but we're going to support those that support us. And in sort of different parts of the industry, like when you look at things like right to repair and in Explore Act, like I talked about earlier, those are very bipartisan issues. And automotive should be generally pretty bipartisan because everyone loves a car guy and gal, right? And everybody supposedly loves the industry. Unfortunately, the issue with EV policy really became very politically divisive.
Right.
And so, but one of the things that we're trying to do also is start to bring some folks that maybe were sort of siding with their caucuses to help them understand what the impact is. And again, we saw that happen in a very blue state called Connecticut, where they didn't adopt California's ACC2. So we saw, and that was led by members of the Democratic Party, which again, most people would say, oh, they don't they don't like us. Well, that's not true. But helping connect the dots and understand what these impacts are, we can bring them along, because it really shouldn't be a politically divisive issue. This should be what's good for the economy, what's good for industry, what's good for American manufacturing, what's good for American jobs, and that shouldn't be a politically divisive discussion to have.
Yeah, I agree. I think when we talk about internal combustion engine bans, that's when it forces. If you're in this industry or you enjoy it or like it's time you can't sit on the sidelines anymore. You need to be involved and have your voice heard because it affects business. This podcast wouldn't exist without internal combustion engines. There's a lot of different facets to it. For people who want to get involved, They've heard what we've talked about. They want to be involved in this and future things that you guys are working on. How can they connect with what you're doing at SEMA?
Sure. So the easiest way is sign up at SEMASAN.com. So SEMA, SAN, so as in SEMA Action Network, SEMASAN.com. But then also if you have an individual question, email us at governmentaffairs@sema.org. Our contact information is on the website. It's under SEMA.org's website. If you go to the advocacy button, our contact information is all there. So if you have an individual question or an individual issue, or you want to get involved and want to figure out a way, please call us. And maybe you can't do it right now because again, everyone's got lives to be part of, but we'll always keep everybody up to date and involved in our campaigns, because that's the power that we bring to the table. That's the political muscle that we need. And I think that's, you sort of talked about, we're dealing with an internal combustion engine ban, and now it's a bit of a gun to our heads right now. And the fact is that I think one of the biggest challenges we had to overcome, and we are still overcoming, is that, we're all, I think, pretty common sense type people, right? It's like, oh, that'll never happen. If you told me 10 years ago we'd be having this debate right now, I'd be like, nah, that's kind of crazy. But the fact is that it is happening. And if we don't act right now, it's going to happen to us versus us getting everything sort of stabilized and back to technology neutral when it comes to our vehicles, so that we can then continue to do the things that we do very well. So no voice is too small. And again, the easiest way is to sign up at SEMASAN.com, or you can just give us an email at governmentaffairs@sema.org, and we'll get back to you.
I'll make sure and put a link in the description so people on YouTube can easily click over. I really appreciate your time today, Karen. This was fantastic to learn about. I didn't understand the depth and the intensity of what was taking place, and I didn't understand about the 60-day window and why we need to get involved. So I appreciate you chatting with us, educating us, and I appreciate what you guys do nationally, locally, in different states. And I look forward to chatting with you guys in the future about some other important things I'm sure you guys will be working on. It was great to chat today.
It was great to talk to you, and thanks so much for the opportunity.
Don't forget, Diesel fans, make sure and head on over to Kershaw.kaiusa.com. Use code 25TDP40 to get you 40% off MSRP. It's a great way to save some money, get some cool gear for a new EDC knife, hunting, fishing, something around the job site, around the house. They've got you covered with a bunch of different choices for blade steel, blade shape, handle design, different opening mechanisms, and their whole lineup's designed to meet any budget. We really appreciate them offering that discount code just for Diesel Podcast listeners. Also wanted to give a shout out to some of our Patreon supporters, Tyler Loewen of 23 Diesel, CUTTERUP Rob, Robert, all of our other Patreon supporters, all of you who subscribe on YouTube and podcast apps, follow us on social media. We appreciate all your support here in year 9 of the Diesel Podcast and look forward to bringing you more of the content that you want to hear in 2025. Till next time, keep the shiny side up.